is under embargo until 11:30. Ms. Malerato Musiane, Chief Director responsible for labor statistics, will assist the Statistician General to take your questions at the end of SG's presentation. SG will deliver the presentation for us. SG, ready when you are.
Okay, good.
So today there's no sanitization here. Today there's no sanitization. Where is our team that manages this?
No, they sorry.
Good morning, members of the media, members of the public, Status Say staff members. I want us to adhere to all COVID-19 protocols and make sure that we keep ourselves sanitized at all times. We are going to talk to you today about the quarterly labor force survey, that is the second quarter of 2021. We are going to talk to you tomorrow about the rebasing of the GDP. So, and you know we have spoken for quite some time about this matter. So we are coming back tomorrow to the same auditorium to talk to you about that. But let us look at the quarterly labor force survey. We have been collecting the quarterly labor force survey in an environment that is within COVID protocols, and our field workers cannot be out there in the field. And as such, what we do is we continue with telephone-assisted personal interviews. And of course, as we do so, we have to ease off the bias, and our control sample is what we worked on from the first quarter of 2020, and as such, we have always been going there so that we make sure that we are able to elevate the numbers or the figures that we make available to yourselves to a national level. Now, let us get straight to the figures that we want to know. The unemployment rate for the second quarter of 2021 will follow suit, but let us first deal with the actual numbers. What have we seen? The movements. We realized that the number of those that were employed in the first quarter of 2021 has declined to the second quarter of 2021 by 54,000 people. And the number of the unemployed increased by 584,000 people, from 7.2 million people to 7.8 million people. And the number of those that are the discouraged work seekers has increased from 3.1 million to 3.3 million. It has increased by 186,000 people. But we see that there are a lot of people who have moved out of the other not economically active to start actively looking for employment. And we can see that we have about 571,000 people who have moved out of the other not economically active category to go and look for employment. And why we call them other not economically active is because that category, as well as the discouraged work seekers, are the not economically active. So what does this 7.8 million people represent in terms of the unemployment rate? The unemployment rate of South Africa in the second quarter of 2021 is 34.4%. This is the highest we have seen since 2008. Let me mention that we have seen a steady rise of unemployment coming out of 2008, where we started somewhere in the mid-20s all the way to the 30s, and now we are hitting 34.4%. as the unemployment rate. Now, let us look at that category that we said we have seen movements. We indicated that we have seen movements in the other not economically active people, and what has happened. What we see is that the students went down by 167,000 people. That's about 0.1 of a percentage point to 36.7%. And the discouraged work seekers went up by 186,000 people. That is up by 1.5 percentage points into 19.7%. And of course, the homemakers went up by 137,000 people, up by 1.2 percentage points straight to 16.4%. And of course, all the others went up. But those that went down are the other. That is all the people that we cannot classify above have gone down by about 600,000 people. And indeed, going down by 600,000 people, that represents a jump of 3.3 percentage point to 6.6%. And this category is the one that contributed the most to move people out of out of the not economically active into actively looking for employment, and thus increasing the number of the people that are unemployed from 7.2 million people in the first quarter to 7.8 million people in the second quarter, thus pushing our unemployment rate of the second quarter of 2021 to 34.4%. Let us see how we have moved in terms of the labor force participation rate, which is the proportion of those of the working age people that are either employed or not employed. And of course, we also want to look at the absorption rate, which represents the proportion of people who are employed. We can see that coming out of 2011, this was quite narrower. The gap between the two lines was about 14.3%, but it is rising closer to about 20%, sitting at the 19.8 percentage point difference, and of course representing a labor force participation rate at 57.5%, and indeed for the absorption rate sitting at 37.7%. I've already spoken about our unemployment rate steadily rising from the mid-20s coming out of 2008, 2011. And we can see that slowly it is rising, with an exception of the second quarter of 2020, where we had a slump or a drop, as you can see, based on the fact that there were so many people seated at home not actively looking for employment. But now it has gone up again to 34.4%, representative of the second quarter of 2021 as our unemployment rate. Let us look at the expanded unemployment rate. We are looking at about the 7.8 million people, plus the 3.3 million people who are the discouraged work seekers. So the 7.8 million people are unemployed as actively looking for employment. The 3.3 million people are your discouraged work seekers, but we also have another 800,000 people who didn't look for employment for other reasons other than discouragement. And when we bring those together, we come to 11.9 million, which brings our unemployment rate to 44.4%. So we can see that the percentage points difference between our official unemployment rate of 34.4% and then our expanded of 44.4% is about 10 percentage points. Let us look at how the provinces are faring and how they are doing. Generally, we have always had the Eastern Cape having the highest unemployment rate, that is the brown color. The unemployment rate official in the Eastern Cape has always been higher. And as you can see, it's sitting at 47.1%, meaning that there are more people in the Eastern Cape that are actively looking for employment. Prior to the interview, a week prior to the interview, they indicated that they were actively looking for employment. And we can see that other provinces, particularly rural provinces, have shown similar patterns of higher colors of the official numbers, with an exception of the Northern Cape and Limpopo that have always returned lower numbers closer to the Western Cape. The Western Cape has always returned the lowest unemployment rate in the last few quarters, sitting now at 25.8%. Even when we look at the expanded, jumping from the brown color to the gray color, we can see that the Western Cape has actually returned the lowest expanded unemployment rate at 29.1%. But let us go back to the Eastern Cape. The gap between the brown color and the gray color is smaller, meaning that we have lesser numbers of discouraged work seekers in the Eastern Cape. More people are actively looking for employment. Let us contrast that with Limpopo and the Northern Cape. Limpopo and the Northern Cape have a larger gap between the gray color and the brown color. It means that we have more discouraged work seekers in the two provinces, in Limpopo and the Northern Cape. But also, we have more people who didn't look for employment for reasons other than discouragement, and who would have taken up employment had it been available. But other than that, let me also mention that the Eastern Cape on the expanded unemployment rate has been hitting about 50% for quite some time, sitting now at 53%. It's the first time that we see provinces like Limpopo and the Northern Cape hitting the 50% mark in terms of the expanded unemployment rate. As we can see that Limpopo is sitting at 49.9%, and indeed the Northern Cape is sitting at 50.3%. Let us go further. The formal sector accounts for a larger chunk of the number of people who are employed, accounting for 10.2 million people, and indeed in terms of percentages, accounting for 68.3%, followed by the informal sector at 18%, that accounts for about 2.7 million people. Agriculture and private households, agriculture accounts for about 900,000 people, and indeed private households for 1.2 million people. And indeed 1.2 million people translating into 8%, and indeed the agriculture share translating into 5.8%. In terms of formal, informal, private household and agriculture, which sector lost jobs? It's actually the formal sector. It has lost jobs, about 375,000 jobs, and returning the number of jobs again to 10.2 million people. The other sectors in the form of informal sector, agriculture and private households have seen slight increases. Now let us go to this formal sector and see what has happened. We can see that we have seen more gains this time from construction. Construction has been depressed for quite some time, and it hasn't been creating jobs, but this time it created 143,000 jobs more from the previous quarter, and trade 108,000 jobs more, agriculture 69,000, transport 66,000, all the way to mining and utilities. Utilities, that is gas, electricity and water, accounting each for about 3%. Now the biggest losses were in finance. Finance lost about 278,000 jobs, followed by community service and social work, which lost 166,000 jobs, and 83,000 jobs were lost in manufacturing. Let us look at the share of employment in terms of the share of nominal GDP. We can see that trade, construction and agriculture, as usual, tend to have a larger share of employment as opposed to their share of nominal GDP. As we can see, the blue color surpasses the gray color. So when the blue color surpasses the gray color, it means that that sector is having a lot more employment, a lot more share of employment as compared to its share of nominal GDP. Let us look at trade, for example. Its share of employment is about 20.5%, yet its share of nominal GDP is sitting at 14.9%. Let us look at agriculture, sitting at 5.7% share of employment as opposed to about 3% share of nominal GDP. That is 2.8 to be exact. Let us look at in terms of education levels. Graduates remain the ones with the lowest unemployment rate. That is, their unemployment rate continuing to sit at lower than usual. I see here my, yes, they are saying it's 23.4% lower than the national average, but it is sitting at 11%. So the unemployment rate of graduates is sitting at 11%. Other tertiaries sitting at 24%. Those with matric and those with less than matric have higher unemployment levels than the national average. Let us look at matric sitting at 38.6% and 39.1% for those with less than matric. Let us look at age cohorts. Young people aged 15 to 24 years still remain vulnerable to labor markets, sitting at 64.4%, we can see that they have risen by 1.1 percentage point because the last quarter they were sitting at 63.3%. And of course, we can see those aged 25 to 34 years sitting at 42.9%. And as their unemployment rate becomes a lot more higher, we can see that their absorption rate as well as their labor force participation rate becomes smaller relative to the other age cohorts. Let us look, for example, those aged 55 to 64 years. Their unemployment rate is sitting at 12.4%. So there's a difference of slightly more than 40 percentage points in terms of those that are aged 55 to 64 years as opposed to those that are aged 15 to 24 years. Let us look at those not in employment, education, or training. Those aged 15 to 24 years are accounting for about 33%. And let us explain that. Those aged 15 to 24 years in our country are about 10.3 million, 10.2 million. About 3.3 million of those are not in employment, education, or training. And those that are aged 15 to 34 years account for about 44%, 44.2% of not in employment, education, or training. Let us go straight to the population groups. We can see that the population group of Black Africans remains higher than the national average. It is sitting at 36.7% as opposed, let me correct that. The population group of Black Africans is sitting at 38.2% as regards unemployment, as opposed to the national average of 34.4%. And the other population groups are actually less than the national average, with whites accounting for 8.6%, Indian Asian accounting for 19.5%, and of course the colored population group accounting for 28.5%. It's only the Black African population group that remains more vulnerable to labor markets and more exposed to higher than the national average. And of course, if we remember, in the first quarter it was sitting at 36.7%. Let us go further and look at men and women. Black African women are most vulnerable to unemployment, sitting at 41%. That gives them about 42.2% percentage points above the national average. And of course, when you look at that, 4.2 percentage points above the national average, you can see that no other category in terms of the population groups of females is actually sitting higher than the national average. But when we go further in terms of the expanded unemployment rate, we can see that Black Africans and coloreds in general are more vulnerable to labor markets, because there are more of them that if they are not actively looking for employment and they don't get employed, they are actually discouraged work seekers. And of course, let us look at additional information in relation to COVID-19. About 82.7% of the people were expected to work during the lockdown. Only 17.3% were not expected to work. And those who were working, we can see those who were working from home were more professionals and managers, because they have the tools of trade. The likes of yourselves and I can work from home, whereas those that are domestic workers, sales and services are usually expected to work from their site of employment. And of those that were working, we are saying that about 91% of the employed continued to receive pay during the lockdown, and only 87.2% received full pay, while 12.8% received reduced pay. And we want to look at reduced pay in terms of education categories. We are saying that 9 out of 10 graduates received full pay in the second quarter of 2021. The share of those receiving full pay increased between first quarter and second quarter, but of course, except those with matric, where it declined from 86.4% to 85.4%, declined by about 1 percentage point. So let us recap. We are saying that the unemployment rate for South Africa in the second quarter of 2021 was sitting at 34.4%, and it has increased by 1.8 percentage points from the previous quarter. And of course, we are going further to indicate that finance, community services, as well as manufacturing contributed the most to the job losses. And the number of those not economically active increased by 386,000 persons. Not increased, it decreased by 386,000 persons. The next slide says Ndihela Kwala, meaning that I finish here. And I can assure you, Program Director, that the next slide, as always, will be blank. I thank you. Sanitize that. You are not. She's not adhering to the COVID-19 laws. When I went there, she didn't sanitize. I think you must help her with sanitize.
We'll open the floor for questions. Members of the media are reminded that the report is still under embargo. The floor is open for questions.
There are no questions. Members of the media are just waiting for the embargo to be lifted so that they can quickly go and find.
Second, still going to see the report. I'm sure there was one person concerned.
Thank you. I'm doing so from Creative Council Media. I have 3 questions this year. My first question is that the rain was going to be difficult today. First question is that we've been, as members of the media or myself, I've been watching the storytellers of the fluctuation of the economy of South Africa. I believe that in these 3 storytellers, like the rent, the currency of South Africa, those who are dealing with the currency of South Africa, the Stats SA, as we are here today, as well as the JSE. If you can look at, if we've been, the last time we've been looking at JSE as well as the rents, the currency of South Africa, they are almost telling similar story, even though they were economic performance, but it was not that much. The Stats SA is telling a far different story, that there was a decline of unemployment, of which it is inside the economy of South Africa. Why is that SA, the story of Stats SA is far deeper than JSE as well as the currency of South Africa? I don't have to. Then my second question is that has Stats SA managed to find that this rate of unemployment, have the Stats SA able to differentiate or to notice that COVID-19 had an impact, or it was just the normal decline, or decline of the unemployment? Then my last question is that in this unemployment, did the industry shuttered completely, or the industries have reduced the staff the staff that were working there? Thank you very much.
To do with the impact of COVID-19. Firstly, is that there are 2 levels at which we talk about the impact. The first one is what we saw in the second quarter of 2020, where there was a dip in unemployment. So unemployment declined. That was last year, because not so many people were actively looking for employment. So people were seated at home. But after that, we are talking about a different impact altogether. The impact that we are seeing, and that's the point that he's asking down there, so you're asking the same question. The impact of COVID-19 is that most industries have shut down. Most firms, not industries, most firms have closed down. And having closed down, certainly it has an impact. And we can see with the rise in unemployment continues to rise. We were sitting at about 29% at the time when COVID-19 started hitting our shores. We are now sitting with about 5 percentage points more, sitting at 34.4%, indicating that unemployment is continuing to rise. So this point that you raised as your first person, we are saying unemployment is decreasing. Unemployment is not decreasing. It is increasing. What is decreasing is the number of the employed, as we have seen, and it's quarter on quarter. From the first quarter, we have lost about 54,000 jobs amongst those that have been employed. So the number of those who are employed lost about 54,000 jobs. And then, but the number of the unemployed increased by about 586,000 jobs. 586 or 584? 584,000 jobs. So we see that there is an increase, but we also see a lot of people coming out of other not economically active, coming to actively look for employment. And they have actually made an increase in the number of those that are unemployed. In the first quarter, we're sitting at 7.2 million people unemployed. We are now sitting at 7.8 million people unemployed, which represent 34.4%. But other than that, when we take the 7.8 million people, together with the 3.3 million people, together with the about 900,000 that the 3.3 million people are discouraged work seekers, together with about 900,000 people, 900 or 800,000 people who didn't look for employment other than being discouraged, we come to 11.9 million people, which then brings us to an expanded unemployment rate of 44.4%. So there's a 10 percentage point gap between the official unemployment rate of 34.4% and the expanded unemployment rate of 44.4%. Which industries have gained employment? It's construction, 143,000 jobs. We are seeing trade, 108,000 jobs, and agriculture, 69,000 jobs. But there are other industries that have lost employment. Those are manufacturing, 83,000 jobs were lost. Community and social services lost about 166,000 jobs, and 278,000 jobs were lost in 5 years. So it's not an entire industry that closed down. Because if we were to see, let me give you an example, why finance has lost the largest number of jobs in the form of 278,000 jobs. If that industry had closed down, it would mean that the entire banking sector would have closed down. Consultancy, lawyers, real estate would have closed down. So it's not an entire industry. It's just certain firms in different industries that have closed down. Thank you, Felicia.
Thank you, SG. The embargo is lifted.